I was in Verdun last week for a couple of days at the two ends of a trip down to Alsace-Lorraine to look at the Second World War battlefields there, including the Maginot Line for sure, one of those places where the First World War meets the Second. It's almost 40 years since I first went to Verdun, and I've been back more times than I can remember, but I never ever tire of visiting that ground, which in so many ways defined aspects of the Great War, the year 1916, especially, of course, for France and Germany, but I think in a wider way as well. Forested after the conflict, the evidence of battle at Verdun is everywhere beneath the canopy of trees that cover that former battlefield. And this time I noticed in quite a few areas there's been a lot of tree felling on a large scale, something I've seen there in the past. Then it was often intrusive and damaging to that landscape of the Great War, trenches and shell holes pulverised by logging vehicles, and the removal of trees, and the destruction and scattering of archaeology and even human remains was everywhere, something I once saw on a terrible scale at Coke 304 on the west bank of the Verdun battlefield quite vividly. But this time they seem to have approached it differently. The removal of trees, it's a different approach, I think, because while trees have been removed, what we see is the opening up of the ground, exposing it, enabling us to see that landscape of the First World War. And around the Bois de Cour, I noticed this in particular, where Colonel Driant was killed in February 1916, for example. But what has been done has exposed rather than destroyed battlefield areas, and in many cases, for the first time, you can clearly see trenches and the moonscape that once characterised this area in 1916. Often there is change on the old front line. I've seen it so often over the years, but this time it is peeled back the present to show the past and reminds us, I think, just how much there is to see and discover beyond the Somme, and how much there is to continue to learn and understand and discover in this vast, vast subject of the First World War. So let's get to this week's questions. Question number 1 comes from Carl Collett. Do you know of any World War I veterans that after the war were allowed to be buried within the war cemeteries next to their fallen comrades? I'm guessing they were not, as they weren't a casualty of war, or when they did eventually pass away, give instructions to be buried or cremated in and around the battlefields that they fought on during that conflict. Well, first of all, if we kind of consider the purpose of the British and Commonwealth cemeteries, and we're going to look at this from a British and Commonwealth perspective. They were created out of the end of the First World War, where right across, for example, the Western Front, there were hundreds, if not several thousand cemeteries with British and Empire dead within them. They couldn't be maintained, many of them indefinitely, because they were too small, scattered, sometimes just a few graves in one area, and then the decision was made to move many of those burials into larger post-war concentration cemeteries and create the silent cities, as Rudyard Kipling called them, the permanent cemeteries from the First World War, which we know when we visit those battlefields today. And the purpose of those burial grounds was to immortalise the dead from that conflict, to commemorate those who had fallen on the field of battle, and eventually with the missing to create memorials to list them by name on panels. So no thought really was given to veterans who, down the line, feeling very, very strongly about it, might want to be buried with their former comrades. Once the cemeteries in France and Flanders and other battlefields were complete, they were, and this was the phrase used at the time, they were closed for burials, so no further burials could take place. And the consideration of veterans wasn't really in that equation. And while we might think that many veterans might have wanted that, I think probably as many that would think that that would be something that they would choose after their death, others wanted to turn their back on the war and forget it. And perhaps that was the last thing on their mind. So as I say, this wasn't really part of the equation. However, one of the exceptions to this in that interwar period, and indeed beyond, were Imperial War Graves Commission gardeners. And when you go to quite a few cemeteries on the old battlefields, you will find the graves of gardeners. Now, when you died in service with the Imperial War Graves Commission, you did have the right to be buried in a designated plot within a military cemetery for gardeners, or be buried in a local cemetery wherever you were living in France or Belgium, and indeed in other places as well, and have your grave marked with a Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Imperial War Graves Commission headstone. And there's some well-known examples of this. If you go to Ypres Town Cemetery, for example, in the middle of one of the big civilian plots there is the old Imperial War Graves Commission gardeners plot, where there are still quite a few isolated burials in there. Many of them were moved into the main British plots of Ypres Town Cemetery, because with civilian graves in Europe, they are generally there for around about a century, and then they have to be reclaimed, repaid for. Otherwise, the grave, the burial site, is redistributed and is then opened up to new burials. But in there, you'll find a lot of former Imperial Commonwealth War Graves Commission gardeners. And when I go there myself, there's a couple that I knew in those early days that I visited the battlefields, who were First World War veterans. But right across the battlefield area, you will find these graves. When I moved to Courcelette in the 1990s, I discovered that there was a gardener buried in the communal cemetery at Courcelette, and he had been a veteran of the Royal Sussex Regiment, had fought on the Somme in 1916, had served with the Commission in the post-war period, and then died in the 1930s and was buried in the communal cemetery there. And he's one of many, many like this. So that wasn't necessarily an old soldier choosing to be buried in a cemetery. This was about the circumstances of death when they were serving for the Imperial War Graves Commission. So to answer your question then, Carl, are there any examples of this? Well, much, much later than I know for sure there were. But these are unofficial burials, not of complete human remains, because that would require the preparation of a proper grave, and these war cemeteries are still closed. But I do know that there were burials of veterans' ashes in some of these cemeteries, or the scattering of veterans' ashes. So in the early days of the Western Front Association, I often used to go to the WFA branches to give talks. And one particular branch, they had quite a few veteran members, and those veterans had connections to Lancashire regiments. And it became a bit of a thing that when they passed away, the veteran had left instructions in his will for his ashes to be buried or scattered at Avalui Wood Cemetery, Lancashire Dump, on the Somme. Now, this was a cemetery on those Somme battlefields that bore that Lancashire name, and these men, either having come from Lancashire or served in Lancashire-related units, thought it was an appropriate place for their ashes to be scattered or buried. And unofficially, I know this was done quite a few times in the 1980s and 90s as that generation of veterans passed away. And I have heard of other instances of this where veterans' ashes were scattered in certain cemeteries. But as that generation of veterans passed away, this was at a time there wasn't a lot of public interest in the First World War, so I don't think that was very common, unlike veterans of the Second World War, where I know, for example, at Arnhem, a large number of veterans requested for their ashes to be scattered or buried in Arnhem Oosterbeek War Cemetery. And indeed, I've attended ceremonies on the Normandy battlefields where this has been done as well. But all of this is unofficial. So what that means is you won't find, Carl, any plaques to any of these guys within any of the cemeteries. That is not allowed. It was known within families and friends, but it is not something that is generally marked. Another slight element to this, which I'll end with, is mothers who wanted to be buried as close as possible to their sons. Now, this is a an idea that I'm going to work up into an eventual podcast episode. So I won't give too many details here, but I know now of at least 2 examples of mothers who lost sons in the Great War. It was their desire to be buried as close as possible to where their son's grave was. Their son's grave was in a military plot within a military cemetery, so they could not, as a civilian, be buried in there. But in the 2 examples that I know of for sure, the soldiers' graves were in communal cemeteries, so French civil cemeteries with a military plot, and around it were French civilian graves. And these mothers bought a plot as close as possible to where their son's grave was within that military plot, surrounded by these civil graves, and were buried there. One at Esters and the other one at Le Cateau. So there was another, I think, element to this where family members wanted to rejoin, as it were, a casualty who had fallen in the Great War. And I remember sometime in the early 2000s at Carnoy Military Cemetery on the Somme, the ashes of the brother of a soldier who was buried there were added to the grave. So this is, I think, something that does happen. And I think it's right, and I think it's proper. It's very touching and moving to think about this, and there are so many elements to it. And in respect to the mothers who wanted to be buried close as possible to their sons who had died, that is something we'll return to again. Question number 2 comes from Dave Batten. My question is about snipers in the Great War. How prevalent were they? How were they selected? And what training was given? I've been wondering about this for a while. We know that sometimes commiseration letters to family would say that a soldier had been shot by a sniper and killed instantly because the truth was too appalling to share. Also, anyone in a trench is only likely to be hit in the head if they die by a bullet rather than shrapnel, but it could have been any stray shot rather than being aimed by a marksman, and yet probably was reported as sniper fire. Well, you make a good point there, Dave, because when you read these accounts that appear often in local newspapers where soldiers died and comrades or the officer has written to the family, this reference to snipers, men being killed by snipers, is very prevalent and probably, as you suggest, was often used to hide the grim truth of how some of these soldiers died. And it gives this kind of impression that the Germans had entire battalions of snipers operating on the Western Front. So what was the truth? Well, every army in 1914 went to war to fight a mobile war, not a static war. And snipers tend to be something more common in static conflicts, where a war has ground to a halt on a landscape, in a town or a city, and that's when snipers or marksmen can come in to their own. And in every army there were marksmen, men who were trained specifically to be very good shots. And in the British Army, it was a volunteer army, professional army. Men were encouraged to have good levels of marksmanship, and they were paid more if they were a better shot. And for a regular soldier, that was a big deal because it meant more money for the wet canteen, or as I've often said before, a tart in the back streets of Aldershot. This was a regular army, it wasn't an army of choir boys. But marksmanship was incredibly important. But that didn't mean that every marksman was, in inverted commas, a sniper. And there weren't really sniping units as such in these armies at that time. And another element to this, I think, is that the Germans arguably had a much stronger firearms culture, especially relating to hunting in parts of Germany where there were forests or mountains, where there was a tradition of going out and hunting wild animals with rifles. So that meant that you had, probably compared to Britain, a much greater number of young men who were used to using rifles like this, who were pretty good shots, and it was part of their culture. So the German army in 1914 brought with it, essentially, because of this, many expert shots, which were expert shots outside their military training. And given the incredible German optics, sights and field glasses and telescopes and everything else that could be used to spot and then snipe, that gave the Germans a bit of a upper hand and the ability to accurately shoot on the battlefield, which proved very useful indeed when the war went static and suddenly you were locked into areas where an enemy was sheltering in cover, in trenches, in buildings, which were not complete. There would be gaps in them, and if you had marksmen, snipers, you could then harass that enemy, kill that enemy using that method. But did every British casualty, as you describe from the newspaper reports, did they all get killed like this by snipers? Well, I think that you hint at the reality of it. I mean, when we read the memoirs of First World War soldiers, and when I interviewed men back in the 80s and 90s who had fought in the Great War, they told some terrible tales as to how terrible death could be on a First World War battlefield. We don't need to dwell on that, really. But I think that the idea that men died quickly and suddenly and without pain, and 1 minute were there and the next minute they were gone, was a kind of comfort, not just to the families who received that information and therefore didn't dwell on what might be the circumstances of a soldier's death. I think it also helped the men themselves come to terms with how they'd seen their mates get killed on these battlefields. But coming back to sniping, the British reaction to this was a lot slower. While there were soldiers who were marksmen, who were very, very good shots, there wasn't the same gun culture in Britain. And one of the practicalities was that while the short magazine Lee-Enfield rifle was an incredibly good firearm, very accurate indeed, there was a lack of sights, of scopes for them to use to more accurately fire and snipe at the enemy. So this type of work was something that took a lot longer to develop in the British Expeditionary Force. This began to change, though, in 1915, as it was clear that a static war would continue. And also it changed with the arrival of Hesketh Pritchard, a big game hunter who had been rejected for military service, initially on account of his age, and then got into the army and was put in charge of press correspondence behind the lines. Not a particularly glamorous job, and certainly not what he was looking for given his background. But it was clear to him when he spoke to those that were in the front line that the Germans at this stage of the conflict had the upper hand when it came to sniping. And in late 1915, he was given permission to start training snipers using his skills as a big game hunter, leading to the establishment of proper sniping schools and the establishment of snipers into infantry battalions in what was called the Scouts and Snipers section. And their role wasn't just to shoot and kill the enemy, it was an observation role to gather intelligence as well. So they would set up outposts where they could observe the German line and gather information as to who was opposite, what the kind of movements were, where the weak points were, where trench mortars might be located, and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't just about shooting people, it was about intelligence gathering as well. It was said, once this sniping school and his ideas were put into development, it was said that his initial work in levelling out the sniping war had, to quote, reduce sniping casualties from 5 a week per battalion to 44 in 3 months in 60 battalions. And when we kind of do the maths with that, essentially that is saving thousands of lives. So while there was initially no challenge to this German sniping activity, the development of British and Empire snipers levelled things out again. Hesketh Pritchard ended the war with the Distinguished Service Order and the Military Cross, and he was running the First Army School of Sniping, Observation and Scouting. And I think that his work left an indelible mark on the culture within the British Army that would retain snipers from then to the present day. And after the war, he wrote a book based on his experiences called Sniping in France, an absolutely classic memoir, rare in the first edition, but available in quite a few reprints and well worth looking out for. And there are a few other sniper memoirs out there, which we may well cover in Forgotten Memoirs of the Great War in another part of this podcast. But just to end, one of the veterans that I interviewed, which I've spoken about on the podcast before, did serve as a sniper. His name was Albert Chesters. And this is a good example where training can replace a culture. So with no gun culture, no firearms culture in Britain really, to ordinary people, Albert Chesters is a good example of this. He was a working class lad who had gone into coal mining, which was the kind of family job. His father and his brothers were coal miners. When he left school aged 12, he lost his father and at least one of his brothers in a coal mining accident before the Great War. He'd never fired a weapon in his life. He'd never joined the territorials. When the war broke out and they were talking that the war would be over by Christmas, he thought, well, if I join up, march around in the countryside for a bit, get paid, do something slightly different, I can then just go back to coal mining afterwards. So he joined the 17th Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and as soon as he started musketry training, as it was called, firing a rifle, it was clear that he was a natural crack shot, and he benefited from this sniper training that Hesketh Pritchard had put into place, and he became part of the 17th Royal Welsh Fusiliers Scouts and Snipers section. And when they went across to France in late 1915, he served with them on the Levante front, as he called it, and he was carrying out sniper activity there. And he went into quite some detail as to how he would set up sniper positions to take out Germans on the other side of no man's land. And he told me a few of the stories relating to this. And then one day he paused and he said, well, of course, he said, I only shot officers. He said, I didn't shoot ordinary blokes like me. I just shot the officers. And we've been trained how to recognise the officers. So I always picked on them if I had to open fire and shoot somebody, which was quite an interesting statement in its own right. And when he was in that static front on that Levante, Fleur Bay kind of area, his sniping was incredibly useful in their day-to-day activities of trench warfare. But when the battalion moved from that sector down to the Somme to take part in the attack on Mametz Wood, he had his sniper rifle, his Lee Enfield with the scope taken off of him, given a usual rifle, sent back into an infantry platoon, and then went into battle with fixed bayonets in the second attack on Mametz Wood, where ironically he was shot by a German sniper who shot him through the knee while he was trying to get a shot at this guy up in a tree. And that brought his war to an end, and he was discharged because of his wounds, and indeed went back to the coal mines in 1917, where he carried on working until retirement age, dragging that gammy leg behind him because of his injury on the Somme in 1916. So it's a fascinating subject, snipers, something that we haven't had a dedicated podcast about, but it is something that I do have in mind for later on this year. So there will be something a bit more detailed about sniping in the Great War coming down the line. Moving on to question number 3. This comes from Matthias Giesel. Matthias asks, I've just finished a battlefield walk from St Gravenstaffel to Passchendaele and couldn't help but notice the sticky and deep Flanders mud all over the ploughed fields. It got me thinking about how difficult it must have been to traverse the battlefield without getting stuck. How on earth can anyone attack or even move in that terrain? My question for the podcast is, how were stretcher bearers specifically affected by the mud during the final stages of the Passchendaele offensive? Would they attempt to cross the mud to retrieve the wounded? And what was the general impact for the medical care in such a moonscape? Well, as you may know, landscape is a really important part of this podcast. The understanding of landscape and its role in our comprehension of the battles of the First World War and battlefields of that conflict too. And when we look at that landscape in warfare that went static very quickly for long periods of time, mud was often a massive problem, not just at Passchendaele, at Ypres, but on many battlefields of the Great War, where assaults could literally get bogged down in the mud, and weapons and equipment and tanks later on also having problems with this. And it was in areas where there was a concentration of fighting, where shell fire could destroy these landscapes by mass bombardments of millions of shells, and not just destroy the landscape, but more importantly the drainage, which then resulted in the flooding of this ground, making the situation worse. Flanders, the ground around Ypres, is the epitome of this, really, and the geology there, and geology, part of our understanding of this landscape, made this worse with the blue clay level beneath the battlefield preventing drainage. So while the surface level drainage was destroyed, and that was so important in civil life, with the ditches by the side of the road carrying the rainwater away, preventing the fields from flooding so the farmers could go about their work. When that was gone, beneath was the blue clay level, which prevented drainage, so the water wouldn't naturally drain away. It would be held in that upper level close to the surface because the clay wouldn't allow the rainwater to drain away. And that meant that when the ground was pulverized by shell fire, it would create this sea of mud that we associate with battles like Third Ypres, Passchendaele. Now, the conditions at Third Ypres were especially bad. When the attack went in on the 31st of July 1917, the first day of Third Ypres, it began to rain that day, and for much of the rest of the battle, it didn't stop raining. There were periods in which it was dry, but generally it was the wettest summer in living memory, which compounded all these problems with the bombardments, the lack of surface drainage, the blue clay beneath, heavy rainfall. Then it turned that ground around Ypres into this muddy quagmire that was a moonscape of shell holes. And we've got so many accounts of this. There are some really good Canadian ones. Canon Scott, who was a chaplain in the 1st Canadian Division, describes going up to Passchendaele across this shattered ground. And when they're burying the dead, he said the bodies were all slick with this layer of liquid mud. Everyone was covered in it. And Will Bird, who was in the 42nd Canadian Infantry, the Black Watch of Canada, he describes when they were slightly out of the line before Passchendaele, they'd noticed that one of the tanks had got stuck in the mud and was on the lip of this shell crater, and it was loose, and they decided to have a bit of a lark about, basically, with two ends of the tank. Will Bird and his mates were rocking this thing like a rocking horse, and as they did that, there was a squelching noise from under the tank where the shell hole full of water was, and the head of a German soldier bobbed up to the surface, which made them stop rocking the tank. But what we see then, of course, with all of this is it's not just men disappearing into this mud, it's horses and mules and donkeys and limbers and field guns and even tanks, half buried or almost totally buried. There are some photographs of some of the tanks around Polkapelle, for example, post-war, where they're buried almost up to the level of their roof. So it was a great, great problem. And just surviving in that kind of landscape was something in its own right, let alone fighting in it. And if you imagine that ground with the conditions as they were, the moonscape of shell holes, the attacks across that ground were very, very difficult. I remember seeing some German aerial photographs some years ago showing the aftermath of a British attack during the Third Battle of Ypres, where it was an area that was literally a moonscape of shell crater after shell crater after shell crater. And when you look clearly at this aerial shot, you could see the bodies of British soldiers lying in the water-filled craters, lying around the lips and the gaps where they tried to move through, and the Germans had trained machine gun fire on it, and the men had just been mown down. So the conditions were very, very difficult indeed. And if we factor in the stretcher bearers' role in this, stretcher bearers, battalion level stretcher bearers, was part of an infantry battalion. It's a myth to think that these men were conscientious objectors. You couldn't be that in an infantry battalion, because as part of the stretcher bearer section, you could be transferred back to a rifle platoon at any moment and have to do fighting. But generally, the medical officer, who was normally a lieutenant or a captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps, they would select some of the better men within the unit, more intelligent, able to act on their own initiative, with the requisite skills to do this work. They would be excused a lot of duties, so they wouldn't have to go on trench raids and wiring parties and carrying parties and so on. But of course, their job on the battlefield was quite difficult. They could carry a weapon, but they didn't have the capacity to carry medical equipment, a stretcher, and a rifle. So they went into battle unarmed, and their job in the midst of shot and shell was to go out there and recover the wounded. Generally, they worked in two-man teams with one man either end of the stretcher. They'd go out, find a casualty, do some work on him to stop the bleeding, to initially dress the wound. You can imagine in this muddy conditions of Passchendaele of Ypres, that was very difficult to properly dress a wound without getting the mud in there and then potentially causing infection by pushing mud into an open wound. it was kind of compounding the problems that the soldier had. So it was very, very difficult work, even just to do that. But once the soldier was stabilised and could be moved, load him onto a stretcher and carry him away. Now, again, think of these conditions that we've just described. Moonscapes of shell holes, muddy conditions, water-filled shell craters. If you slip off and into there, you're going to struggle to get out. And you're not just carrying yourself now, you're carrying a casualty on a stretcher. And this is very, very difficult work. For just 2 men, it's almost impossible under these conditions to get a wounded casualty off the battlefield. So what you see in the contemporary accounts and also contemporary images is more and more men being involved in the carrying of the stretcher. So rather than just 2, with one guy at the front holding the front handles of the stretcher and one at the back doing the same, you've got 1 man on each corner. So 4 stretcher bearers now to take a soldier away, because you need that number of men to get this casualty across this landscape, this shattered landscape, and back to a point of safety. But as the conditions get worse and worse and worse, more and more stretcher bearers are required to carry 1 stretcher. And again, we see this in contemporary images, one of which I will use as the artwork for this podcast to give you a bit of an idea. So there were great problems in working in these conditions. And if you think of a landscape around the village of Passchendaele, smashed to bits by the bombardments, that there were a few farm buildings where cellars could be used to bring casualties back to. Often that was the RAP, the Regimental Aid Post. Sometimes bunkers were used, but that had problems. The Royal Sussex, South Downs battalions in the initial stage of 3rd Eep had captured some bunkers around St Julian, for example, and the medical officer of the 13th Royal Sussex had set up a post in a bunker there, with the back door of the bunker was now facing straight towards the Germans, and that resulted in a shell coming straight through that door into the bunker and killing the casualties and some of the stretcher bearers inside. So this was a great problem. Where did you have that point of safety that you could bring casualties back to? You couldn't have them lying out in the open because of the conditions on the ground. It was a huge, huge problem. And as the battle moved on, I think we mentioned this in a recent podcast, once you got to Passchendaele, you were about 18 hours away from Ypres. That's how long it was taking to get back to Ypres across that shattered ground. And as a casualty, would you survive that journey on a stretcher? 18 hours on a stretcher, badly wounded, being evacuated across that ground. It might take that long to get to a point where you could be put into a horse-drawn or a motorised ambulance and taken further back to a dressing station or a casualty clearing station. So these were all factors in treating the wounded. And when you read the accounts of units that were in the 3rd Eep, there are many occasions in which the whole evacuation of wounded completely broke down. And I remember looking at the New Zealand Division's attack in October 1917, and when they first moved into the line in the area where they were going to make their assault, they'd just taken over from the 49th West Riding Division, and they were astonished, their senior medical officer was astonished, that the bulk of the wounded from that division's last attack was still out there on the battlefield. So the Assistant Director of Medical Services of the New Zealand Division had to utilise his own New Zealand medical personnel to go out and recover British Army wounded that had been left behind by the previous unit. I mean, why that didn't end up in a court of inquiry, I don't know, but it probably highlights the intense problems that units had with the evacuation of casualties under these kind of conditions. So it's a fascinating subject, and if you want to learn more about stretcher bearers and the kind of things, the challenges that they faced and the work that they did, I can't recommend enough Frank Dunham's Long Carry. Dunham was a stretcher bearer in the 1st 7th London Regiment, in the 47th London Division, later on in the 58th London Division as well, and it's a classic Great War memoir. It was one of the later ones that came out in the 70s. It's never been reprinted, sometimes hard to find, but a really, really good book. And Long Carry kind of highlighting, I think, the very title of the book, the incredible problems that stretcher bearers had in carrying the wounded and the sick off those battlefields of the Great War. Question number 4 comes from Alex Watson in Brighton, and we're staying on a Passchendaele-related theme here. So Alex says, my friend Jack and I are after some books on Passchendaele Third Ypres. Our knowledge tends to be focused around the Somme battle, so we would be interested to hear what books you'd recommend for us to build our knowledge up of Ypres and the associated Belgian frontline fighting. Well, as you know, anyone listening to this will know, I'm always recommending books. I mean, you cannot read enough books on a subject like the Great War, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them. He says, looking round the room where he's recording this, looking at all the bookshelves covered in Great War books. So it's a never-ending task trying to find books, I think, and part of the pleasure of continuous learning that the Great War brings to us all, including me. I mean, I've just come back from the battlefields with a few books that I picked up there. A new photo book about Verdun, a new French book about the Crapouillots, the trench mortar units that were in the First World War. So there's always something new to find, and books are our segue to this learning, and very important. You can't just learn from podcasts. You can't just learn from YouTube. Reading about the subject, there is no alternative, really. So, in terms of books about Passchendaele Third Ypres, well, we've got to start with what was my start for that battle, my introduction to Passchendaele, which, of course, is Lynn MacDonald's They Called It Passchendaele, which I remember going to Foyle's in London, where it was still on the shelves there. I bought my copy just after I came back from Ypres for the first time in 1982, and I've read that book again and again and again. And I see now that it is available as an audio book as well. And audio books are a really good way to focus on learning. Listening are as good as reading a book. So use your audio books if you've got a subscription to that. But Lynn MacDonald's They Called It Passchendaele is a classic veterans account of the First World War through those veterans that she interviewed in the late 1960s and early 70s and on into the 80s. She brought together those interviews into that book to tell a story of the Battle of Passchendaele. It's not the whole story, it's only an element, a layer of that story, but nevertheless an important layer, because already when she was doing these interviews, that generation was rapidly fading away. And her work, I think, remains essential to our understanding of a battle like Passchendaele. So that's a good way to start. Now, as I've spoken about before on the podcast, there's kind of layers to using books, and you have to layer your knowledge and how you acquire it. So you've read a good kind of introduction to Passchendaele through Lynn MacDonald's book. The next stage is to look at the kind of three levels of this, which are histories, official histories, memoirs, and then guidebooks. Now, in terms of the histories, I mean, there is an official history of the Third Battle of Ypres, published by HMSO quite a few years after the Battle of Passchendaele, from the official historian Edmonds, telling the official account of operations at Ypres during the Third Battle of Ypres in July to November 1917. It's not going to win the Booker Prize for its prose, but it is the official account, and that's worth knowing. But in terms of popular histories that have been written more recently, and the historiography of how a battle is written about is really important. So you don't have to just read the good books, I think. You have to read the bad ones as well. And a good place to start with that would be Leon Wolf's In Flanders Fields. Now, that was a best-selling book in the 50th anniversary of the Great War period, which many people read. A hugely influential book, and was about this battle in the mud and the failure of command. And it was written before the availability of war diaries and a lot of the official material, so its value as an accurate history of the Third Battle of Ypres is not particularly good, but I think it shows how half a century on from 1917, people viewed that battle and that conflict, a battle like the Somme, which for many kind of defined the First World War. But if we were to look at more recent popular histories, based on good research and academic rigour, but are readable, I would thoroughly recommend Passchendaele, The Sacrificial Ground by Nigel Steele and Peter Hart, who, when they wrote it, were both working for the Imperial War Museum and used a lot of the material there, brought together new ideas about Passchendaele, tried to understand the battle, the geology, the landscape and everything else, and it remains, I think, an essential book in our understanding of Third Ypres, joined in more recent times during the centenary itself by Nick Lloyd's Passchendaele, A New History. And you might think, how can you write a new history of Passchendaele? Well, with all of these subjects, there is plenty more still to say. And another half century from now, I'm sure someone will be writing a new book about Passchendaele as well. But Nick Lloyd's book, Nick Lloyd, an academic, is a really, really good account, well-researched account of Passchendaele, and works well with Nigel Steele and Peter Hart's account. And if you want to understand a bit more about some of the fighting, but also understand what Passchendaele looked like, then Peter Barton's Passchendaele, which is one of his big landscape format panorama books, heavily illustrated, well written, well researched text, again, is highly recommended. It's out of print now, but you can get it on places like eBay. It's a huge chunk of a book, but it's very good. The visual side of our understanding of battles like this is hugely important. You can read those well-written accounts by Nick Lloyd and Peter Hart, Nigel Steele, but looking at the images, I think, kind of brings those words to life. So Peter Barton's book is really good for that. So that's kind of layer one. That's the histories. Memoirs, if we move on to that next layer, well, there are obviously many memoirs out there for men who took part in the Third Battle of Ypres. But if you wanted a couple that I think are especially good, that would be P.J. Campbell's In the Cannon's Mouth. He was a gunner officer in an army brigade, Royal Field Artillery. He wrote this one about Third Ypres and then the second one about the German offensives of 1918. In the Cannon's Mouth is a really good book which tells you what it was like to be a gunner officer at Passchendaele, supporting the infantry on this battlefield. Great descriptions of the landscape and the problems that he faced. He's pretty honest about some of the things that he did and he saw, and it's a fantastic memoir. To me, those books by P.J. Campbell are really up there in some of the best memoirs of the Great War. So that's a good one to look at. From an infantry perspective, Edwin Campion Vaughan's Some Desperate Glory is an absolutely classic memoir of an infantry subaltern. He was in a territorial battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. The book came into print thanks to historian John Terraine, and it first came out, I think, in the 70s or 80s. There's a hardback edition, there were paperback editions, and I think it's been reprinted since. But his descriptions of going into action in the attack near St Julian on the 16th of August 1917, as they cross the Steambeak into that shell-smashed landscape, he gets bogged down in the mud. He calls to his men to try and get him out. They can't hear him because of the bombardments, and he has to resort to firing his pistol into the ground just in front of his men to try and attract their attention, for them to turn round and realise that their officer's stuck up to his waist in the mud and he needs help. So it's great on that kind of description. And those two books, both written by officers, but nevertheless young, impressionable officers, honest about their experience, will give you a really good insight into the kind of soldier's eye level of Third Ypres as well. And on our next and final kind of level of understanding, when you want to travel to that landscape today to understand a battle like Third Ypres, then that's the guidebook, starting perhaps with John Giles, founder of the Western Front Association, his book, The Ypres Salient Then and Now, which is kind of a photo guidebook, certainly one of those that hugely influenced my own early travels across that Flanders landscape. And then Rose Coombs' MBEs, Before Endeavours Fade, covering the whole Western Front, but obviously with chapters on the ground around Ypres. That's kind of one level. The Battleground Europe books, published by Pen and Sword, cover different aspects of the Third Ypres landscape, often from both sides, including my own Walking Ypres, which gives you a kind of heads up on walking the ground today. But there are many other guidebooks out there as well. John Cooksey, the late John Cooksey, and Jerry Merland did a whole series of guidebooks which are really, really good. And of course the Holtz Classic guidebooks are there to give you a kind of overview of a battlefield. And there is one specifically relating to the ground around Ypres. But that kind of work on the landscape as it is today continues. And last year I picked up a brand new map from the shop of the In Flanders Fields Museum, which is called In Flanders Fields, and it folds out and it shows a landscape, principal memorials and things like that. But all of the cemeteries as well, including cemeteries which no longer exist and were closed and moved into British and Commonwealth concentration cemeteries, but also German cemeteries that were removed from the landscape and concentrated into the bigger ones in the 1950s. So it's a really interesting and important map, perhaps one of the most important to come out for many years relating to that landscape of conflict in Flanders. So on your next visit to Ypres, pop into the shop, the Flanders Fields Museum, where the tourist office is, and it's well worth searching that map out, and it's good to have in your Great War library. So, as always, I've cost you a lot of money there searching those books out, but there is no replacement for knowledge gained through reading books like this. It's how we truly come to grips with a subject like the First World War and begin to understand it. So that's where we end this week's episode. Thanks for those questions. I hope the answers have been of interest. As always, keep the questions coming in through the usual methods of email and the Discord server and a few others besides. And I'll see you again soon for some more questions and answers on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.